I'm setting out today to give you some of the background to this Bishop's statement that has just come out, and to persuade you of its great importance, and hopefully to urge you as well to take on this new statement as something of an agenda. Personally, and as a St Vincent de Paul, as part of a wider church effort, as the Australian society searches for a new economic model. So maybe if we could have the first, So how did I come to be in this? A few years ago, I got invited onto the Catholic Social Justice Council. And so that would have been about 2013 or 14. And so at this time, what my specialty, in terms of research and all that, is social policy. So look down the bottom. This was me at the table at the council. I knew all about inclusive growth in Australia, and more latterly this new book coming through, Reframing Global Social Policy. It all sounds a bit boring, doesn't it? But it's really very exciting. So there I am sitting at the council, and we had a very hard-headed chairperson, Bishop Chris Saunders. And so it got introduced to the meetings, and inevitably at some point in the meeting, he'd have a big grumble about neoliberalism and the terrible economic policies that the nation was suffering under. And so with these little books, like Inclusive Growth in Australia, I just found the answer for him. Because I've been campaigning and researching this for years and years and years, and it seemed to me that around about this time there was a change of mind happening across the world in places where it really mattered, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And of course these had been people that we'd always considered the enemy in a way, because in the 1980s and the 1990s, these were the structural adjustment people who went through nations and tore down governments and put markets in their place and thought that the market was going to be the solution to all of their problems of growth and development. So it was I was quite fired up, even at a late stage in my career, to be reading the World Bank and the IMF and these people saying, no, the model's wrong. We've had a change of mind. It's not delivering human development for people, and it's seriously flawed. We need a new economic model. So it took a long time for me to persuade people that this was actually happening, but it was. And it was happening at the same time, though. And this is where I think Bishop Saunders used to get grumbly, because around about this time, if you might be aware of, Pope Benedict had brought out the encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which theologians thought was the greatest thing ever. It was rethinking the economy and society and putting society at the centre of things, not markets and all of that. So there was that. And Pope Francis, he was on the march. Especially on these things, and he had a great slogan about it was the end for the trickle-down approach, the trickle-down economy. It's not trickling down, it's got to stop. So I think Bishop Saunders was picking up some of this church dissatisfaction with the way economic policies were being run around the world. And here was little old me. I said, look, I got my book. Here's the new model. So I think out of conversations like that over time, in their wisdom, the council thought, well, let's put forward this idea to the bishops that we do a statement that tries to marry up this new chapter in Catholic social teaching with these new ideas that seem to be taking hold around the world about the way we run our economies and the way we run our society. So if we go to the next slide. So now, when we did this, I was in there with your Bruce Duncan, Father Bruce. He was the theologian man, he had all the teachings. And we had Dave Freeman, a counsellor from Tasmania. He had all the hands-on stuff about what's happening around Australia with unemployment and homelessness. So that was the mix. We had to put it together. And but we were a little worried, because if you criticise the system, neoliberalism, right, inevitably some people are going to get angsty and and defensive, and so it was quite interesting how a little before the statement came out, Bishop Long, the new chair of the council, had given a talk up in Sydney at the Whitlam Institute, launching and celebrating Race Matthews' great book on labour and liberty, if you haven't seen it, about the Catholic social teaching's impact in Australia across 20th century, well worth getting. But anyway, in the course of the thing, Bishop sort of said some critical things about the neoliberal model, and those people came out on blog sites that you can't, what's he doing is there's nothing wrong with the market economy and all of that. So there's always scope here around a statement like this that it could get political. But we're not too worried about that. We're not too worried about that because I think that amongst all these people these new authorities I've been referring you to, nobody's saying it's the end of capitalism or the end of the market economy. They're just saying that market economies, in fact, many of the market reforms, like in Australia from the 1970s, opening up the economy, like lowering tariffs, I think most people would agree was a lot of that was, not everyone will agree, was such a good idea. But let's say within that period of reform, there were a lot of good things happen, and a lot of economists can take a resounding pat on the back for the change, but not all of it was good. And so if you want to question, see, well, what were the issues? There's nothing better to read than Commonwealth for the Common Good. I think it came out about 1991, was it? And it's a terrific, sharp take on this new movement in economic policy in Australia about markets being the answer for everything, and really highlighting the points of criticism.
I'm just wondering who wrote that book, Commonwealth for the Common Good.
This was the Catholic Bishops of Australia. After that, it was a huge consultation. It took years to produce. There was a last major statement on the economy. So, but as you can see, this was what we've been battling with. It was a kind of a small government kind of view of the world where the markets had become the one size fits all for everything. So, in terms of state, as the Commonwealth for the Common Good said, any regulations or interventions by government became suspect. So we had a whole period of privatisations, deregulations and all of that. So when we're saying, what's the old model, if we're in transition to a new one, that's what we're referring to. Okay, now, some of my friends, as I say, I've been on this campaign for so long, and a lot of people thought he's a bit nutty, right? I look around, I see neoliberals everywhere. And is it really happening, Paul? So we could debate that, but just look at these two architects of the old model. Paul Keating, he's quoted this year, saying, liberal economics has run into a dead end and has no answer to the contemporary malaise. And then John Hewson, who was the fight back man, who was really the economics professor who personified the old model, says, I'm not a socialist, I believe in markets, but I want them to work for the greater benefit of our whole society, not just to benefit a few. John Hewson, wonderful, isn't it? So what are some of the things, where can we expect debate to be heating up in the year and years to come? Well, he's got his little list that he's not happy with, and he's not even a socialist. So that people who work in the social services, they're underpaid. Multinationals aren't paying taxes. Privatisation has led to exploitation and gouging, price gouging. Look at electricity, airports, airlines, tollways, hospitals. So should these things just be left to the market after all? It's all those questions are reopened, and so that's what we're beginning, that's what we're engaging with now. You need to be engaging with, Vincent de Paul and the church needs to be engaging with, we've got to rethink the fundamentals of our economic and social policy. We need a new model. Okay, so how did all this happen? Now this being a professor, I mean, it's going to be a bit boring. right? Because it'll be dry. Academic arguments that's what they are, they're dry. So I'll try to liven it up as we go along. So what were when I was watching and seeing this transition happening, this change of mind, what were we seeing? Well, the first thing, top point there, growth, people wanted growth. If we have growth, we'll all be better off. But they were saying the argument grew up once again, but it doesn't automatically equal development for all, right? So if that's the purpose of that, we're trying to spur the economy on to make the cake bigger and bigger. If it's the 2% who are not just getting the icing, but they're getting most of the cake as well, and other people are left maybe unemployed, poor or whatever, it's not human development. What's the point of it? So it's an old debate, but it's been won, re-debated and won again with we need a model of economic growth which actually translates into what Paul VI might have called integral human development, right, for all the people. So that was, in parallel with that, you had some very important books came out by academics, notably that French guy, Thomas Piketty. He got all over the newspaper, you might have heard of it, and people suddenly saw the facts, face to face with the facts, that inequality was growing, had grown to dimensions not seen around the world in developed countries, not seen since the 19th century. The middle classes were sinking, the poverty was growing, and the inequality was rife, and something had to be done. So that was the first sort of wave of thinking. But what really, I think, pushed people over the line was the global financial crisis. Because all along we'd been forced to believe, we've been told to believe that markets are always, solutions are always much more rational and will give you better outcomes than any form of government intervention or social tinkering, right? So we'd left on the belief in the faith of the rationality of markets being superior to politics and governments and all the rest. So we had the bank crashes and all the rotten mortgage sort of selling and schemes and things. So the pillar, that pillar of the old model collapsed underneath it. But in the meantime, one of the really important things going on in the world is the shift of the energy. All the action is shifting more to the east, and the developing economies, right? To China, India, Latin America. This is where the action is, and but what we noticed there over the last half a dozen years, or at least decade, has been the explosion of social policy initiatives by government. So social policy, good society ideas isn't a luxury people have when they're developed. The social policy needs to go in now as you are developing. So look at that there, just to give the dimensions, the new face of the global social policy. The 5 largest social assistance programs in the world are provided by China, India and Brazil to cover all those people. It's equal to the European population. So as I'm going to show you now, what's happening, especially through the United Nations Agenda 2030, they're trying to bring the developed countries and the developing ones together around a common economic social model. My friend?
I'm just curious about the social network in China, the social net, because I wasn't aware there was a welfare system in China. Is that what you mean?
Well, I think that we're talking, say, old age pension systems, health insurance systems. So social, when they say social protection, they mean the full gamut. Like, yeah. I mean, it really is, we need to be aware of this when we hear people say, oh, you can't afford social welfare. Just over in our neighbour, Indonesia, they've just gone ahead a couple of years ago with a national health insurance system. More than half the people don't have proper jobs and can't pay proper fees, but the government says, don't worry, we'll top it up, we've got to have health insurance for everybody. So this is just around the developing countries, there's an explosion of policy initiatives happening. So it's part of this picture of why governments or these international agencies are urging all nations to get behind a new economic social model. Yeah, okay, all right. So we can go a bit, that's the big pitch, right? The world coming together around a UN agenda focused on a more inclusive economy and a sustainable economy in terms of the environment. Okay, so it's I think the Pope Francis has used this term, and you come across it. What we're actually engaged with here is redefining progress, redefining what we get up in the morning and go out and try to do and make in our society. So, Commonwealth for the common good, of course, they didn't have. You didn't have a social goal. There's no such thing as society, you might recall from Margaret Thatcher. Or social justice, that's a mirage, it's a myth. We leave things to the market. We don't plan for society. So the Commonwealth, when we talked about the common good, it was reduced to purely monetary, this is their quotes, and even the GDP. If the GDP grew, the Commonwealth, the common good grew. The new model rejects the idea that market efficiency and just GDP growth equates to greater economic wealth for all. So how do we bring the society back in? Okay, now there's huge amounts of work have gone on around this, and I think an illustration would be the one that's got everybody talking, like what do we need, what targets do we need to set? What should be part of our common good package, our new common good package? So these sustainable development goals that were announced in 2015, and all countries, including us, are meant to be working out how we're going to achieve it. So if it's not just GDP growth, what sort of things should we be looking at? There's an economic dimension around employment, and there's a social dimension around equality and education. There's the environmental dimension, and there's the good governance. So this is what it's hard to believe, and for many years we said, "Oh no, don't worry about all of those. We'll promote the market. The market is very smart. The market will, come up with a solution." So this is what we have to be consciously saying. Well, these are the things we need. These are explicit goals we need to set in our national package. So, and this is it's a great thing to explore some of these reports. The libraries are full of them, where they do international comparisons and all of that. And so, just to illustrate how useful this can be for us when we start thinking, well, what sort of Australian society do we want? So, on the UN's social SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals Index, we came a very poor 20th in the world in 2016. But interestingly, on the Human Development Index, that's another one that the UN has, we were ranked second as humans. So how do you explain the difference? Well, the latter one didn't include environmental sustainability goals. So obviously we did really poorly on those to drag us from second to 20th. So that's just an illustration. Now that we're starting to think, well, it's not just the economy, stupid. There's a society and there's a planet we've got to factor into our policies and plans. This is the sort of exercise countries are getting into. Thanks. All right, now, so we can start to think about our goals. And what we're going to have in the Australian package, because this is what the UN says. This is a time for countries around the world to be renewing the social contract. So what's going to be in the contract, right? What kind of a society goals are we going to set for ourselves? So it's not just about the goals, though. It's about, what are the relevant policies? What are the levers? What we should be thinking about needing to get there, right? So there's been two big movements of ideas. It's very academic, but it's quite interesting. There's been two big movements of ideas behind all of this policy shift. The first one comes from the developed countries like Australia and the old welfare states in Europe and America. And the other one I'll show you next comes from the developing economies, because they've tended to work in separate worlds. We're only coming together now, right? So the old welfare state ones, we started to recover the idea because that social policies, looking after the society, might actually be a good economic thing. It could be an investment. So writers started to say, well, we need to move away from the welfare state to the social investment state. This is actually important, not just for people, but for the economy. So what have they packaged? This is a serious development. Like if we were in the European Union, we'd have to be reporting back to the central government on what they call the social investment package. Each country has to tick the boxes to say what it's doing about its social investment package, right? So we'd be able to tick most of the boxes, by the way, but this is what they see as really important. So the big focus was on human capital. They call it. It sounds a bit yucky. You're just a bit of human capital. But it's really, they're referring to people's education and skills, the things they can take in to become a productive person in the economy, right? So this is particularly important. Wasn't important in Grandad's day. Grandad left school probably at primary, right? But today, if you leave school probably without some and don't get some tertiary thing, what chances are you going to have in the knowledge and services type economy that's evolving in front of us, right? So this is why this huge emphasis on the human capital. So it sounds a bit dry, but it's about all those things people can learn and do and go out into the world and contribute in the building of the economy. So and it starts at the early years, but it can't be just your schooling. If you haven't got a house, it's a multi-dimensional thing. If you're not well fed, if your parents don't have satisfactory money, income, then it's not going to work. So it's a multi-dimensional approach to thinking about what that little kiddie needs if he's going to grow up or she's going to grow up to be a really full participating person, looking at it over the life course, schooling, transition to work, transitions to care, lifelong learning, and all of that. So in the book coming out, it comes out in November, the new book. You'll see a whole chapter analysing how all this investment goes into the people, creating the stocks of human capital the society needs, right? The flows. Do people, they don't just work in their lives, they have families, they go to education, they go to schools. It's not all about work. As people make these shifts, do we ensure that they don't lose their human capital if they're parenting, for example? So and buffers. Well, everybody's got a good chance of being unemployed or underemployed, and they're all going to be old, and so you need these buffers, which is like traditional social protection, social insurance to get people through those times. So there we go. So that'll do for that one. So around, as I say, typified by the European Union's social investment package for all its member states. This is where a lot of countries have been moving, getting this more active view of welfare as good for society, but in turn good for the economy. Okay, back in China and India and Latin America and many parts of Asia, the developing economies, it was a different story. It was around inclusive growth. Now just take this top line, right? So you can have all the education, you can have all the skills and all the things that you need in the world, but if the economy doesn't offer any opportunities, what's the point, right? And so in many experiences of development, the development's been very uneven. Small sectors, small might have pocketed the benefits of growth, and others left to stagnate, right, in traditional, maybe agriculture or whatever. So these the economic policy people are saying what you have to try to get is a sort of an even spread in your pattern of economic development so that everybody benefits, they all get the opportunity to participate and so on. So in a nutshell, that is what inclusive growth means. So governments have got to get more hands-on in managing the economy, not just getting people ready, right, to participate, but they've got to manage the economy so the opportunities are there. Right, so, hands-on management. So this way we can see that I think this is really important. It's one of the things that when people are, like the Bishop's statement and others are trying to, what they're appealing to is people feel as though as a society we don't have any say or control or management over the economy and where it's heading, right? So how can we, as the Archbishop Welby, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's just brought out a document on a new economic model. He says we have to wire the social justice values and ideas into the production. It can't be just some compassion at the end of the day after the economy's done its work. It's got to be a socially just economy. So that's, I'll say a little bit more about that, but this is a big departure. And so, but by bringing the productive side of social interventions to think, we can see in a way we're more interested in pre-distribution, preparing people to go out and to get work and so on, than we are in just repairing them if they happen to run into unemployment or whatever, or some shock along the way. So this is the shift. An economy, it's got to be like a level playing field before people go in to participate, and this is before we think about what welfare might also do, the taxes and transfer system, to make a better society. Thanks. Okay, so, all right, so we've got, if we just pause, everybody look this way. We started off and we saw how, well, we're not just leaving it all to markets and growth now. We've got a set of goals broadly under the ideas of inclusion and sustainability, like the UN agenda. And now we've just been looking at, well, what are some of the things we actually have to be doing with our policies to start to achieve those goals? And so, so from a society point of view, right, that can't anymore be just about, oh, well, we'll come along with handouts and welfare after the thing. We've got to have society, through its government, engaged in the economic management that is going to produce this pattern of development. So it's about education and skills. These are the kind of, this is taken from a manual people produced, like if in your country, if you want to have inclusive growth, what do you got to do? You've got to tick the boxes on education and skills, employment and labour, that's wages and all of that, asset building and entrepreneurship, support for small business, home ownership, and the next one. And we know all about the top one. The finance system has to be organised in an appropriate way to fully support the real economy. You need good governance structures, no corruption and all the rest. You need the basic services and infrastructure, health, computers, and you need the taxes and transfers. So all of these things, if they're looking at a country and saying, is this an inclusive growth one? How are they doing? That's the kind of dashboard of KPIs you need to be ticking across the board. So the whole economy becomes geared towards those goals of inclusion and sustainability. Next one. So now, this is why I'm quite happy to be sort of almost retired. Honorary professors are almost retired people, because this conversation in Australia is building up, right? I mean, you mightn't see it every day, but believe me, as a watcher, it's like the gardener watching things grow. Things are really taking off in Australia. If we want to be part of it in the Vinnies and we want to be part of it in the Catholic Church, we've got to be in there doing this now, not in a year or 2 years' time. So the trade unions and community groups, there's an alliance. I wasn't a part of it, but I knew all about it. they put together about 10 little video clips about, they just got together, so what do we think the important policies are? Then they asked some people for information and ideas, and they did one of those, where you raise money on the internet. They got some money together, and a friend sort of helped produce these videos. So there's about 10 of them. The Australian Labor Party. I know this because I was an academic advisor on the social policy review that Jenny Macklin undertook, which you can find in a book called Growing Together. So they took all these ideas and went around with all their people and worked up a complete rewrite of ALP social policy following these principles. At the same time, there was an economic policy review done. So none of these things are final and this is it, but you can just see the conversation is happening. People are absorbing these ideas, taking them on board, and they'll be hitting the road. And I think very exciting for us in the community sector. There's been a huge build-up to the ACOS October Congress this year. And guess what? It's all framed around Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Agenda 2030. Big session at the opening, and then sessions during the next couple of days looking at what can we do in particular areas. This is what we need to be doing. This is the conversation. And I've already mentioned the Archbishop of Canterbury over in England with a think tank group called IPPR. Well, they've got together and they're producing their own report on what they see as the new economic model. So all of this amounts to what people are trying to articulate, starting with these ideas of inclusion. We talk about the common good, we want the common good. They're starting to say, well, these are the goals and this is how we're going to get it. And so what we need to be doing is identifying the action priorities for Australia. Okay, that's just a few ideas. I mean, we almost skipped this. I'm just saying here, the key church policy agencies, if we were really serious, we've got so many of the major providers of services and players in Australia. They should be working, like that Archbishop of Canterbury, towards a comprehensive contribution to this debate. This is what the church thinks about a new model. But it's not something that you and I are irrelevant to. We're not going to get the new vision, the new experience of the common good from the bishops or from the Social Justice Council, all of that. They've got a role to play, those agencies, but it has to be complemented by the grassroots process. The public interest or the common good can't be defined top down, right? It must be embedded in values and interests of the people. Okay, all right, so here we go. We're all set to participate in this remaking of Australian society and economy, and we've got a framework to work towards, and there's many other people out there conversing. So what would Professor Paul, what would he nominate as high priorities? So I'm just going to give you two. So the first one is, I think, out of all of that stuff I shared with you on how the world changed its mind, I think when we're thinking about society, the big break away from neoliberalism is this idea of social policy being productive, right? It's not, and so we've got to break away from what the welfare mentality, right? This is the idea that it's just handouts after the event, right? Social policy, and too many people, even in the welfare system, still think this neoliberal way. It's just about the taxes and the transfers. What we've got to be lining up for is a new form of economic management for a pattern of development that reflects our social environmental goals. So I'm very glad to be here today. I have to put this in. I'm running out of time. I have to put this in. Many moons ago, 1850s I think it was, ancestors got married in the church. and so one of the good things that happened to our family tree was in the late 19th century, Australia, the land was largely locked up by graziers, people who just had sheep running around the place, and the ordinary people couldn't get access to the land. So there's a big campaign called Unlock the Land. And what it meant was that a lot of ordinary folk actually got to, to have their farms and built lives for themselves. So this is what I would see is, it's not airy-fairy. We've got to manage a broad-based development, right? But it's about policies like that, whether it's land reform or whether it's investing in the human capital today. These are the things we've got to do if everybody is going to get those opportunities. Okay, next, please. Next one. Yeah. How long have I got? All right. Five more minutes. I can do it in 5 minutes. Right, so this one, so this is all those, what I was just talking about there, well, they're actual policy choices you might make to achieve the goals. But I was very impressed by a speech paper that an ANU philosophers aren't usually very interesting, are they? But he was invited to give an opening paper at the London School of Economics. Now, that's a very famous place. It was having its 125th anniversary or something. So they had all the brightest people in the world around the table. I wasn't there. But he was. And so a lot of them wanted to talk about work or this or that. And he says, look, I think there's something bigger than all of that. And I think it's about governance, right? And what he meant by that was he thought that the role of government and the role of the not-for-profit or civil society, groups like Vinnie's and all of that, had got completely out of whack with people applying the market to social services, right? People taking out the not-for-profit people out of the community sector and putting multinational companies in who are going to do it cheaper. So he said the biggest danger than any of these particular policy areas is to the architecture of our society, like the governance, how we organise ourselves. And he's making this big plea, just like I have and numbers of other people, is it's not just about the market. It also has to be about, we have to reinvent the role of government and the role of the civil society. We need three arms, three pillars of the inclusive and sustainable society, not just always defaulting back to markets, okay? So now, I think this is where the church, having one foot in both camps, myself a bit, has an enormous wealth of experience and knowledge to offer, and it's why people like Pope Francis get such publicity and have such impact, because there is the experience, there are the ideas to draw from. So if we're thinking about the role of the state, the social justice tradition is so strong, right, on all citizens having the social rights, the access to services and so on. So this means let's look back at the role of government to see, is it equipped to do that job? But, and this is where the church has had its most impact, is in this other value, as Pope Francis says, there is no future without fraternity. It's all boys, but solidarity or something like that. So that's, and then there's these other principles, subsidiarity and that. So this is what, if we were organising a future, an agenda for the church to engage with, that's the core of the ideas that they want to be bringing. So can we just go to the next one? And importantly, what I said about how do we define the common good, the church is emphasising here, as Archbishop Auder recently said, we have to return to the grassroots. You are the people who have the first-hand knowledge of the poverty. You have got the grassroots credibility. You can find the on-the-ground people who know well how to organise programs. So it's through dialogue and networking with the civil society or the community groups in solidarity with the people that we need to draw our understandings of the common good. Yeah, so, okay, well, this is just emphasising what I'm saying. We've been through a terrible period where the market was default for everything. We've got to rebuild the state and the community sector. Next, please. All right, now, it gels very much with the international organisations I've been telling you about what they're calling for. So this ought to resonate with you. This is the OECD in 2015. Over the last 3 decades, efficiency became one of the most important guiding principles of the government, putting equity or fairness on the back burner. Fairness and efficiency, they were seen to be exclusive. Now they go together. So promoting inclusive growth requires strong, inclusive processes and institutions to counteract the forces that produce inequality. Or the UN, when it announced the goals, it made these points. You can't rely on conventional growth. We can't just leave it, markets are going to achieve it. We've got to articulate the social values, the environmental values. Get away from cosmetic ad hoc consultation towards a human rights-based approach to negotiation and dialogue. And we've got to pay more attention to the potential of the public and the community sectors in achieving these things. Thanks. All right, so I'll come back to you in a sec because I know I'm pressing the time. Okay, so this, because you are from the Vinnies and it's a passion of mine, the importance of the contribution of the community sector. We don't want to be some long-lost cousins who got banished out the backyard while the big people make the decisions in the room. The sector has to be in the room. So why is this important? From my studies, I was always impressed by William Beveridge, the founder of the British welfare state. So you think, oh, they got the welfare state, they got everything. He said, no, it'll be empty without voluntary action. Vital for democracy. It's all those things that people do. Next, please. Yeah. Maybe we could skip that one. And that one. Yeah, so that was just, those slides just said we did have very strong traditions of participation by civil society and state alongside market, but through the neoliberalism, a lot of that got stripped out. So now we're rediscovering the community. If we could go to the next slide, I think, we have to reassert there is such a thing as society, right? And if you think about it, this is from one of my favourite authors, we grow up in a web of institutions, traditions and habits. And so it's not just the big institutions, but our families, churches, theatres, sports clubs and all the rest. Through these organisations, they diffuse the power across society as a social challenge to state power. As Edmund Burke, the famous philosopher, politician, wrote about the little platoons, much loved of Tony Abbott, I might say. So, but it's true. It's the importance of being attached to the subdivision, the Vinnies group. To love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first link in the series by which we proceed towards the love of our country and to mankind. Okay, next. Yeah. All right, so they've got 2 slides, I think. And so this author, he says, so we need to have a fuller understanding of people. We're not just individuals in markets making self-interested decisions. We are individuals, and it's important that we discover our individuality and express it. But we're also social selves. So we're very much formed and shaped by our community, and we contribute to shape the community in turn. But last of all, he says, and this is why I have to get this in, is about that he's got this phrase, an ethic of divinity. So when we're trying to create this community or this society, right, it's not just any old society. It could be the mafia, right? But what we're looking for is something larger. So if I could have the next final slide. So, and he's got this marvellous quote from, or the idea from Aristotle, where he says, we've got to think about this ethic of divinity. Aristotle believed that the story of the cosmos is one of an unfolding energy by which what is potential becomes actual. For humans, that potential expresses itself in the capacity to deliberate policy about the terms and purpose of their own self-governance. The exercise of such capacity is what gives definition to a society. It is what politics is. Okay, thank you very much. So that, all right. So this idea that we've got to think in terms of not just the policies, but what's it going to take to change the society? Just this week I read an old piece from a guy called Ronald Mendelsohn, a pioneer of social policy in Australia, writing in the 80s. He looked at all the changes that happened and up to the welfare state, but he said at the time it seems that the dream had died. And so he had to have his recipe. So he said the first part is the need for a moral awakening. Without that energy, without that people being committed to a different form of values, all the policy ideas will just sit on a shelf. So I think that's my appeal. Through the Catholic social teaching and the Catholic vision that you'll find in that document, and which I've touched on lightly today, I think you can find the elements of a vision which can guide that moral awakening. Thank you very much.